me. My name's Keith. I'm the Assistant Curator of Arms and Armour at the Royal Armouries, and my main specialism is arms and armour during the 17th century, and particularly the Civil Wars. Today I'm going to be talking about the Littlecote House collection, a number of items of which are on loan to Shaw House. We're going to be examining those and what they can tell us about arms and armour of the period. Prior to the Civil Wars, Britain had enjoyed a lengthy period of relative peace, and at first the native arms industry was woefully unprepared to meet the demands suddenly imposed upon it. Following the outbreak of hostilities, the main royal magazines and militia stores were targeted by both sides as commanders sought to quickly arm their men. Whilst all sides relied on their native arms producers, the scale of the conflict inevitably meant that supplies were sought from the continent. The study of arms and armour during the Civil Wars, of course, relies on surviving pieces. Happily, more survives from this period than in any preceding period in British history. The most important collection of arms and armour surviving from the Civil Wars is Littlecote House collection, which was formed by the parliamentarian colonel and MP for Bath, Alexander Popham. Numerous other private armouries existed following the Civil Wars, however, none survive today. Wilton Towers, for example, was sold in 1857, and the spectacular armoury at Wilton was dispersed between 1917 and 1923. Thanks to the campaign led by the Royal Armouries, the hugely important Littlecote collection was saved for the nation in 1985. So Popham was born at Littlecote House in 1604-1605. Having studied at the University of Oxford, he entered the Middle Temple in London, where he remained from 1622 until 1628. He served during the Bishops' Wars in 1639, and the following year represented Bath as a member for Parliament. As a Presbyterian, he supported Parliament during the Civil Wars, and as such, in 1642, he was appointed one of the Deputy Lieutenants of Somerset and commander of the Bath Regiment of the Trained Bands. In September that year, following the withdrawal of the Royalist Marquis of Hertford from Wells, he took part in the siege of Sherborne Castle in Dorset under the Earl of Bedford. In December, he joined the garrison of Bristol at the head of his own regiment of 600 foot. In the summer of 1643, he took part in the battles of Lansdowne and Roundway Down under the command of Sir William Waller. Following the capture of Bristol by Prince Rupert, he was appointed Colonel of Foot in Waller's South Eastern Association Army. In 1645, he surrendered his commission following the issue of the self-denying ordinance by Parliament, which required all members who also served as officers in the parliamentarian forces to resign either their seat as an MP or their military post. However, later that year, he was active again in the southwest as a colonel of horse. In 1649, he was made Councillor of State, and by 1651, he was a colonel of both a regiment of horse and a regiment of foot in Somerset. Although by and large a supporter of Cromwell, following the Protector's death in 1658, Popham distanced himself from the Republican government and was suspected of involvement in the royalist plot known as Booth's Rising to restore Charles II to the throne. As a result, Colonel John Oakley was instructed by Bulstrode Whitlock, President of the Council of State, to search his house near Bristol, that is Littlecote, for arms and ammunition. A firm supporter of Charles II following the restoration of 1660, he was pardoned and again appointed to the Council of State and returned as MP for Bath. Alexander Popham died in 1669 and was buried at the Church of St. Mary in Chilton Foliot, not far from his home at Littlecote. Unfortunately, those of you who know Littlecote today, the hall doesn't look like that anymore. The Indigenous Collection comprises 32 harquebusier's pots, 39 breastplates, 38 backplates, 41 pieces of cuirassier armour, 10 pikemen's armours and pieces thereof, a siege armour, 3 siege hats, 37 buffcoats, 49 carbine slings and baldric, 1 bandolier and bullet pouch, 3 pieces of equestrian equipment, 9 edged weapons, 35 matchlock muskets, 44 flintlock muskets, 21 carbines, 52 pistols, 7 firearms accessories, plus numerous odd cheek pieces from helmets and other small elements. Now, I've referred to this as the Indigenous Collection, as pieces were actually added later in the 19th and 20th centuries. Evidence from the objects themselves suggests an early Commonwealth date for the main series of harquebusier armours, and research has suggested the volume of supply for the Irish and Scottish campaigns of 1649 to 51 may have led to a surplus of equipment which Alexander made use of to equip his regiment of horse in 1650. During the 20th century, Sir Seton Wills, who owned Littlecote, added a number of pieces to the collection, although frustratingly he didn't state which they were. Unfortunately, there are no surviving records of the armoury at Littlecote from the 17th century, and the 1735 inventory of the house is lost. A late 19th century inventory of the house does survive, however, which lists 6 ancient swords, 35 leather jerkins and accoutrements complete, 6 sets of armour, 24 half sets, 2 crossbows, and 1 leather helmet. It's highly likely that only the armour and equipment displayed in the Great Hall forms part of the original armoury. That being the case, all the pikemen's armour, for example, was added at a later date. So what can we say about the armour and equipment during the Civil Wars, at Littlecote and during the Civil Wars? Apart from a few harquebusier's pots, the majority of the cuirassier armour at Littlecote, of which only odd elements survive, show that the vast majority of pieces were made in England. During the Civil Wars, virtually all armour made in Britain was produced by the Armourers' Company of London. Parliament's control of London and its seizure of the nation's major arsenals at the Tower of London and Hull certainly gave them an initial advantage when it came to equipping their men with armour. However, at least for the first few years of the war, Parliament nonetheless relied heavily on foreign imports. The majority of armourers remained in London to serve Parliament, however a small number moved with the King to Oxford. The largest collection of armour at Littlecote was designed for the light cavalryman or harquebusier. Unlike the more heavily armoured cuirassier, the harquebusier's equipment was ideally suited to an offensive role requiring mobility and tactical flexibility. From the outset, Parliament was anxious to properly equip its cavalry. In the early years of the war, the Committee of Lords and Commons for the Safety of the Kingdom ordered that each troop commander should be provided with £280 to cover expenses. Likewise, in 1645, following the formation of the new model army, numerous contracts were issued to London armourers to supplement the armour already in service. At Littlecote, the collection includes 37 breastplates, 35 backplates, 1 elbow gauntlet, 36 English and continental pots, and 35 buff coats. And there is also a small collection of late 17th century harquebusier armour, which won't be the subject of this talk. Full armour for a harquebusier comprised an open helmet, such as the famous 3-bar pot, a buff coat, and breast and back plates. However, it was certainly not uncommon for men simply to wear a helmet and buff coat, or indeed a broad-brimmed hat and breast and back plates. Just prior to the Civil Wars, harquebusier arms comprised breast, back, and pot, and cost 2 shillings or £1 per suit. However, by 1654, this had fallen to 16 shillings. Probably the most widely recognised piece of armour from the Civil Wars was the three-barred helmet. Known today as a lobster pot due to resemblance of the tail or neck guard to a lobster's tail, the helmet incorporates a triple bar face guard which was attached to the peak. Whilst widely considered to be characteristically English, numerous similar examples were produced on the continent. Nonetheless, they do appear to have been particularly popular in England. Derived from the continental zishaga and prior to that the Turkish shishak, the three-bar pot is depicted in paintings such as Cromwell at Dunbar by Andrew Carrickgow, as we saw in the previous slide, as well as on the posters for the films Cromwell, made in 1970, and Winstanley in 1975. The three-bar pot has consequently become the identifying feature of parliamentarian or Roundhead soldiers. Indeed, this association is still often presented as fact. Whilst it's true that thousands of three-bar pots were produced during the Commonwealth, their use was certainly not restricted to one side and continued to be produced until the very end of the 17th century. The distinguishing feature of Commonwealth-era pots is the simplified design, which you can see on the left. It comprises a narrow neck guard and relatively flat peak. In contrast, those made prior to 1645, which you can see on the bottom right, are of higher quality. This change was no doubt brought about by a need to produce large numbers of relatively low cost pieces in order to meet demand. The harquebusier's armour comprised a back and breastplate secured at the shoulders with plated straps and around the waist with a plain leather belt. Until the 1640s, gorgets were sometimes issued alongside back and breastplates. However, this was certainly not universal practice, as the high neckline found on most cuirasses obviated their need. The bullet dents found on many breastplates were not the result of battle damage, but from proofing or testing the armour against shot. And both cuirasses there have evidence of bullet dents. The one on the left, you can see on the medial line of the breastplate towards the bottom, there's a dent. And then on the breastplate to the right, you can see the bullet dent off at the side, which is the most typical place to find it. So the initial reaction to the growing preponderance of firearms on the battlefield was simply to increase the thickness of armour. Such armour was known as Armour of Proof. One method used by armourers to increase the thickness of armour was simply to hammer weld two breastplates together, resulting in a so-called duplex construction. However, by increasing the thickness, the weight of the armour also increased. If armour was not simply to be made thicker, then the ideal solution was to produce a metal that was both hard enough to present an impervious deflecting surface against cut and thrust weapons, of edged weapons, whilst tough enough to absorb the impact of bullets. Unfortunately, this leads to what is sometimes known as the armourer's dilemma, as hardness and toughness are incompatible qualities in steel. Toughness is an index of a metal's resistance to shattering under impact, whereas hardness is its ability to resist penetration. By increasing hardness, the metal risks shattering under impact. Metal can be made one or the other, but not both at the same time. Such armour, though, was effective. At the Battle of Newbury in 1643, we're told that Prince Rupert was shot at by numerous assailants, including in the face, but escaped hurt thanks to his armour. The buff coat, of which 34 examples dating to 1650 at Littlecote survive, probably comprised the most famous group of objects from the armoury, with the possible exception of the firearms. First developed during the second half of the 16th century to be worn beneath armour, it was not until around the second decade of the 17th century, as plate armour became less popular, that the long-skirted buff coat was developed. Although widely depicted in continental sources, the extent to which buff coats were worn in Britain, particularly by harquebusiers, is not altogether clear. Indeed, rather than being seen as an essential piece of equipment, the evidence suggests that buff coats were either purchased individually or were provided by a regiment's colonel or hometown. For instance, a troop of horse raised for Captain John Bird was provided with 53 buff coats and, oddly, 52 pairs of leather gauntlets by the Liberty of Watford. Nonetheless, references to buff coats appear in contemporary ballads, and in 1647 the term buff coat was used in reference to a cavalry trooper at the Putney debates. Often regarded as being expensive items, most ordinary troopers' buff coats appear to have cost on average 30 or 40 shillings, or roughly up to twice the price of a harquebusier's plate armour in 1640. Of course, expense would be influenced by complexity of design and any decorative embellishments. Officers seem to have regularly worn buff coats, and some trained bands, particularly the wealthier companies from London, also may have made wide use of them. The Royalist news sheet, Mercurius Aulicus, or the Court Mercury, for example, listed trained band buff among the spoils taken after the Second Battle of Newbury in 1644. The design of buff coats closely followed civilian fashion, with many exhibiting close-fitting waists and flaring skirt panels. In the case of cavalry coats, long skirts were essential in covering the otherwise unarmoured upper leg. Buff coats were fastened by a series of hooks and eyes sewn to the inner lining. A length of ribbon could then be laced spirally down a line of holes pierced along the centre front opening with a second ribbon on the side. Listed among its treasures, Royal Armouries, home of early harquebusiers' cuirass and buff coat, sword and gauntlets, dating to circa 1630, which came from Littlecote House. They had been displayed in their own glass case in the Great Hall, along with a pair of mid-17th century buff leather gauntlets, a pair of leather boots of circa 1660, an early to mid-17th century sword, and oddly, a pair of 19th century South American spurs. Apart from the boots and spurs, the objects are traditionally said to have belonged to Alexander Popham. However, they do not appear in a photograph of the Great Hall taken in 1900, nor are they listed in any inventory. Therefore, the likelihood that they were owned by him is unfortunately slim. Nonetheless, they make up a rare surviving assembly of a pre-Civil War's harquebusier's equipment, which may or may not have some relation to the Pophams at Littlecote. Alongside the buff coats, Littlecote preserves a number of baldricks and carbine slings. During the 17th century, there were two main methods of hanging the sword from the body: the waist belt and hanger, and the baldrick. The baldrick, or shoulder sword belt, was often fastened with a buckle at the front, but many from Littlecote have the ends simply stitched together with characteristic crisscross stitching. Being an essential item of wear, one would expect to regularly find them in contemporary documents, but this is seldom the case. Though they do not appear in the orders of the New Model Army in 1645, or that of the Commonwealth in 1649 or 50, they are noted in the regimental arms and armour issues of the Lord General of the Army of Parliament. It's therefore reasonable to assume that men were either expected to purchase their own or had them issued by their commanding officer. Of the 28 mid-17th century baldricks at the Littlecote Collection, 26 are of 4-piece construction and 2 of 5-piece construction. By the time of the British Civil Wars, the carbine had become one of the principal weapons of the harquebusier. Unlike a pair of pistols, which were carried in holsters worn either side of the withers in front of the saddle, carbines, along with blunderbusses and dragons, were carried on a buff leather shoulder belt or sling. The examples from Littlecote's collection predominantly comprise a buff leather strap and buckle and are provided with a spring clip on a swivel for the attachment of the firearm. And on the right of the image, you can see in this Dutch painting that clip attached to the bar of the carbine. Unlikely to be part of the original armoury at Littlecote, pikemen's armour is represented by 5 breastplates and tassets, 1 breastplate, 1 backplate, 1 gorget, and 2 pots or helmets. The extent to which armour was worn by pikemen during the Civil Wars is not altogether clear, although there certainly seems to have been a gradual decline during the period. On the whole, being in control of the nation's capital and with easier access to continental markets, Parliament was better able to supply its pikemen with armour. However, following the defeat of the Earl of Essex at Lostwithiel in 1644 and the loss of the army's equipment, there appears to have been no attempt to resupply the army with pikemen's armour. There are also no references to pikemen's armour in the supply contracts of the New Model Army in 1645. However, it is worth pointing out that there may have been sufficient stores of pikemen's equipment available to Parliament, and as the New Model Army was formed from pre-existing armies, it's possible that soldiers continued to wear armour that had previously been issued to them. I'm going to hope this clip plays. Some of you might recognise yourselves or indeed other people.
Most were armed with a matchlock, which was the dominant weapon. However, finding the pan was carried in a small flask, and the main charge in wooden containers was a posset on a shoulder belt. Loading was a complex and dangerous procedure, so to avoid accidents and ensure efficient firing, musketeers were rigorously trained. The match was a piece of cork impregnated with saltpeter, which burned slowly instead of time. Musketeers were trained using versions of the drill developed by Prince Maurice of Nassau in the late 16th century.
So alongside the buff coats, Littlecote is famous for its important collection of Civil War era firearms, of which the majority are probably part of Popham's original armoury and were not added later. Totaling, not including late 17th and 18th century pieces, 33 matchlock muskets, 41 flintlock muskets, 16 carbines and 51 pistols. It is the largest single collection of mid-17th century firearms in the country and consequently led to new discoveries and refinement of the typology of English locks. Initially, the production of firearms in Britain at the start of the Civil Wars was slow, as it took time for the industry to gear up to meet new demands. With London under its control, Parliament had access to the Company of Gunmakers, which had been established only a few years previously. However, to begin with, much of their time was spent refurbishing existing stock rather than producing new weapons, a situation not helped by the decline in shipments of coal from Royalist-held Newcastle. However, by late 1643, they claimed they could supply all of Parliament's needs. Between 1642 and 1651, London gunmakers produced some 111,000 firearms. Despite this advantage, Parliament was, like the Royalists, still to purchase many of its firearms abroad. During the Civil Wars, the most widely used infantry firearm was the matchlock musket. Developed by the mid-16th century, the musket was the heaviest of all infantry firearms on the battlefield. Its long barrel and large bore made it a powerful and effective weapon, particularly against armour. However, its weight necessitated the addition of a forked rest until muskets were made lighter around 1640. The matchlock, as its name suggests, used a smouldering piece of cord or match to ignite the charge. Working against the action of a light mainspring, squeezing the trigger lowered the serpentine into the priming pan. The Council of War's Order for the General Uniformity of All Sorts of Arms of 1630 specified that muskets should be 62 inches in length, with a barrel of 48 inches long and a bore of 12 bullets to the pound. In 1639, however, barrel lengths were recommended to be 42 inches. The matchlock, though, had many disadvantages. Bad powder and adverse weather resulted in misfires, and carrying a smouldering match cord was potentially very dangerous. After the Battle of Edge Hill, for example, one individual put his hand into a barrel of powder whilst forgetting he held a match in his fingers. The powder exploded, killing and wounding many. Another significant type of lock mechanism used during the Civil Wars was the flintlock. The origins of the earliest flintlocks, otherwise known as snaphances or snaphaunces, a term derived from the Dutch snaphaan or snapping hen, is somewhat obscure, though it probably developed in Germany during the 1530s. The term snaphans technically refers to all lock mechanisms operating on the flint and steel principle, though today it is more commonly associated with the earliest form, with the steel and pan cover made separately. Confusingly, the contemporary word firelock was used indiscriminately during the Civil Wars to refer to any type of firearm with either a flintlock or wheel lock mechanism. In England, around the first quarter of the 17th century, a significant improvement was made in the design of the snaphance mechanism, with the steel and pan cover being combined into one simple L-shaped component. Known today as the English lock, of which there are two main types which can be further separated into other types, this simpler and cheaper design meant that when the flint hit the steel, the pan cover was automatically thrown open in the same motion rather than relying on a complex internal mechanism which had the potential to fail. This development, though, necessitated the addition of a safety device. On earlier snaphances, the musket could simply be made safe by pushing the separate steel forward out of the way of the cock, whilst keeping the pan cover closed and the device cocked. Now that both elements were combined, this could not be done safely without the risk of accidental discharge. The problem was solved with the addition to the lock plate on some, but not all locks, of a small pivoted catch or dog located at the rear of the cock. This feature appeared on locks of many designs and has given rise to the use of the rather vague and non-specific term dog lock, which neither indicates the type of lock mechanism or indeed the country of origin. The flintlock possessed many advantages over the matchlock, the main being that there was no danger of a smouldering match coming into contact with loose gunpowder. Consequently, flintlocks were ideal weapons to issue to specialist companies, such as those who guarded artillery trains. The Earl of Essex, for instance, had 400 firelocks under his General of Ordnance. During the Civil Wars, the proportion of flintlocks to matchlocks increased. In 1645, the ratio was approximately 1:5 or 1:6. By 1650, this had increased to 1:3 or 1:4. In addition to a sword and perhaps a short poleaxe, the cavalry of the Civil Wars was frequently armed either with a pair of pistols or a carbine. Although the majority of infantry firearms were matchlocks, the matchlock mechanism was not practical to use on horseback due to the need to use both hands, if only to keep adjusting the match. Consequently, cavalry firearms were fitted either with wheel or flintlock mechanisms. The development of the wheel lock mechanism was a momentous step in that it allowed for the first time the practical use of firearms from horseback. This had a significant impact on the development of cavalry tactics in the 16th century and from the 16th century onwards. Invented early in the 16th century, the wheel lock operated on a similar principle to a modern cigarette lighter, in that sparks were produced by the action of a piece of hardened revolving grooved steel wheel against a piece of iron pyrites. Due to their complex mechanisms, wheel locks required very high standards of manufacture. As such, the wheel lock remained an expensive weapon which was not issued in large numbers. Many pistols had featured long barrels which made them heavy and unwieldy. In 1639, therefore, experiments were undertaken to see the effectiveness of shortening the barrel. Having found no discernible difference in accuracy between pistols with barrels of 18 inches to those of 16 inches, many Civil War barrels measure 14 to 16 inches in length. The collection of pistols at Littlecote include 2 signed by the gunsmith Robert Murden, along with a number of others which, although not signed, were most likely produced by him. In 1658, he was made gunmaker to His Highness the Lord Protector and assistant to the gunmakers' company. Following Oliver Cromwell's death, Murden secured a similar position under his son Richard, although he retired in 1659. Some cavalry were equipped with carbines, of which 16 were preserved at Littlecote. At Donnington Castle in 1646, the parliamentarians took carbines and pistols off the defenders. Having a longer barrel and larger bore, the carbine had an advantage over the pistol in both range and power, and as such was usually discharged prior to coming in close contact with the enemy. In 1630, the Council of War specified that the carbine was to be 45 inches long, with a barrel of 30 inches and a bore of 24 balls to the pound. However, as with firearms, there was no standardization. At the Battle of Roundway Down, the Royalist Sir John Byron recorded that the orders were given that, quote, "not a man should discharge his pistol till the enemy had spent all his shot, which was punctually observed, so that first they gave us a volley of their carbines, then of their pistols, then we fell with them." Although Littlecote only possesses 6 swords, one of which dates to the 1670, and another which has been fitted with an early 18th century blade, it is worth briefly discussing the 2 main types represented in the collection. One of the items on loan to Shaw House, though sadly not from Littlecote, is a mortuary sword. The so-called mortuary sword, or mortuary hilt, is probably the best known of all Civil War era basket-hilted swords and was unique to Britain. The term mortuary hilt does not appear in any 17th century sources, but rather seems to have been coined in the 19th century by antiquarians and collectors in reference to the male faces often found on many of the hilts. With many bearing a likeness to Charles I, it was thought that these swords were produced in memory of the martyred king. However, the fact that they also appeared on swords which predate the civil wars makes this theory unlikely. Indeed, the majority of faces, some of which were female, most likely reflect the continuation of an Elizabethan tradition for depicting decorative masks on furniture and as an ornamental device. Nonetheless, a few hilts do incorporate crowned heads with the monogram CR for Carolus Rex, though these were probably produced during the lifetime of the king and not afterwards. Apart from the mortuary sword, the other most widely known type is the hanger. During the 17th century, the term hanger appears to have been largely interchangeable with cutlass and referred to any short sword, usually with a curved blade, which could be comfortably worn when fighting on foot. I should say that mortuary swords by and large were cavalry weapons. Hangers were equally popular as civilian and hunting weapons. Whilst many surviving examples feature richly decorated hilts, munition quality examples were certainly produced. One particular striking design associated with Hounslow featured pommels of cast brass in the form of lions' or eagles' heads, which were often silvered or gilt. Interestingly, the pommels were all cast from moulds, resulting in considerable uniformity among the group. It has been suggested the better quality examples were produced for the captains of the London militia, otherwise known as the trained bands. And that brings me to the conclusion of my talk. I realise that there are some items in the Littlecote collection which I've not managed to cover in this talk. You'll find further details in the Littlecote Armoury book, which is on sale from the Royal Armouries. And likewise, if you'd like to find out a bit more in depth about arms and armour of the Civil Wars, their production, supply and effectiveness, then a couple of years ago I wrote a book, Arms and Armour of the English Civil Wars, which is also available through the Royal Armouries. So thank you very much for listening.